This is the story of Jonathan Hayes and his wife Melissa Hayes. They had built something that looked from the outside like a good life. A house with a garden neither of them tended anymore. A marriage that had settled into the quiet efficiency of two people who knew each other's habits better than their hearts. Jonathan had loved Melissa the way some men love, steadily, without announcement, assuming the consistency itself was enough. Melissa had loved Jonathan too, once. But love without witness has a way of going unnoticed, until it goes altogether. What sat between them now was not hatred. Hatred requires attention, but a slow, polite withdrawal, the kind that happens in increments so small that neither person can name the moment it began. This is a story about what people convince themselves they deserve and what it costs them when the bill finally arrives. The coffee was always made by the time Melissa came downstairs. That was simply the shape of their mornings. Jonathan up at 6, the grinder running, the kitchen filling with something warm before the day had a chance to turn cold. He didn't think of it as an act of love anymore. It had stopped being that years ago. Now it was routine, the same way breathing was routine. Unremarkable until it stopped. Melissa came down at 7:15 in her robe, her hair pulled back, her eyes carrying the particular vacancy of a person still negotiating between sleep and the day. She picked up her mug without looking at it. "You're going in early?" she asked, noticing his jacket already on. "Meeting at 8. He was rinsing his own cup. "Should be back by 6. I have dinner with Claire at 7. "Okay." That was it. That was Tuesday. Jonathan Hayes was 43 years old and worked in commercial insurance. Not the kind of work people asked about at parties, but he was good at it, methodical and careful. The sort of man who read the fine print not because he was suspicious, but because he believed in understanding what he was agreeing to. He was medium height, kept himself lean out of discipline rather than vanity, and had the kind of face that registered as trustworthy without being memorable. People forgot him easily in groups. Melissa used to joke early on that she'd chosen him specifically because he looked like a man who would never embarrass her. He'd laughed. He hadn't been sure, even then, whether it was a compliment. Their house was in a suburb 40 minutes from the city. 4 bedrooms, 2 of which served as a home office and a storage room respectively. A kitchen they'd renovated 3 years ago that Melissa had driven the decisions on, and a backyard with a patio they used maybe 5 times a year. It was a house that worked. Jonathan had stopped asking himself whether he was happy in it, the same way he'd stopped asking whether he was happy in the marriage. Happiness felt like a young person's metric. They had no children. This had been Melissa's preference, stated clearly at 31 and never revisited. Jonathan had held a different picture in his mind for a while, a vague shape of a different life. But he'd released it eventually with the same quiet discipline he applied to most disappointments. Aaron Cole had entered their social periphery through Melissa's work. He was in marketing, the agency her company used, charming in the way that men who are very aware of being charming often are. He was 37, recently divorced, and had an easy laugh that filled whatever room he was in. Jonathan had met him 4 or 5 times at company events and found him pleasant enough. The kind of man you could talk to for 20 minutes and feel you'd had a real conversation without anything of substance having been exchanged. He'd noticed, without naming it, that Melissa was different around Aaron. Not flirtatious exactly, she wasn't obvious, but she was more present. She laughed more readily. She interrupted, which she didn't normally do with people she wasn't fully engaged with. Jonathan had filed this away the way he filed most things that made him uneasy, carefully, in a part of himself he didn't visit often. That particular Tuesday, he came home at 6:15 to an empty house, Melissa having already left for her dinner with Claire, and stood in the kitchen he paid for, drinking water from a glass that came from a set she'd chosen, surrounded by the renovated cabinets she'd picked out, and felt something he couldn't name. Not loneliness, exactly. Something more like distance, the feeling of being a guest in a house that had your name on the deed. He ate leftovers standing at the counter. He watched 30 minutes of television without retaining any of it. He went to bed before Melissa returned, and when she slid in beside him around 11, he kept his breathing even and his eyes closed. She didn't check whether he was awake. He noticed that too. March arrived wet and gray, the kind of month that made everything feel provisional. Jonathan had started paying closer attention. Not in any dramatic way, not with hidden cameras or a private investigator's suspicion. More the way a man who has spent 20 years reading contracts begins to read his own life, looking for the clause he missed, the language he agreed to without fully understanding. The text Melissa received after 9 in the evening. The way she angled her phone slightly when he walked into the room, not dramatically, just a degree or two. The natural shift of someone used to privacy. The Tuesday dinners with Claire that had become Tuesdays and the occasional Thursday. He'd run into Claire's husband at a gas station in February, and the man had mentioned that Claire was visiting her mother in Phoenix for 2 weeks. Melissa had come home that Thursday mentioning a funny thing Claire had said over pasta. He didn't confront her. He sat with it. Their conversations had taken on a quality he'd noticed but struggled to describe. They communicated all the necessary information and none of the unnecessary kind. Schedules, logistics, observations about the house. Melissa would tell him about her work in the abstract way of someone fulfilling a social obligation rather than sharing. He responded in kind. They were two people maintaining the appearance of a shared life with the efficiency of people who had quietly agreed to stop investing in it. One evening, making dinner, his turn on Thursdays, he tried. "Do you ever think about traveling?" he asked. Not accusatorially, just genuinely. "We haven't been anywhere since that trip to Lisbon." Melissa was sitting at the kitchen island with her laptop, half engaged. "Where would you want to go?" "I don't know. Somewhere. Portugal again, or..." He shrugged. "Just somewhere." She looked up briefly. "Maybe in the fall." It was the same answer she'd given 2 years ago about repainting the living room. The answer that meant, "I'm not interested in this conversation. But I don't want to have the conversation about why I'm not interested." "Sure," he said. "Maybe fall." He turned back to the stove. There was a Friday in late March when Melissa was on a call in the home office. Aaron's voice audible through the door. That easy laugh of his, carrying through the wood. And Jonathan sat in the living room with a book open on his lap, not reading, just listening to the rhythm of a conversation happening behind a closed door in his own house. He wasn't angry, that was the strange thing. He mostly felt tired. The door opened after an hour, and Melissa came out looking lighter than she had in weeks, her cheeks carrying a faint color. She saw him on the couch. "Working late?" he asked. "Campaign review. The Henderson account." She was already moving toward the kitchen, and he noticed she didn't meet his eyes. Not guiltily, just the habitual avoidance of someone who had made a private decision and was living on the other side of it. "How's the Henderson account?" "Fine. Coming together." He nodded. She poured a glass of wine. They sat in the same room for another 2 hours, each with their own screen, and exchanged maybe 6 sentences. When Melissa went upstairs, she paused in the doorway. "Jonathan." He looked up. She seemed for a moment on the edge of something, like a person who had opened a door and felt the temperature change and then quietly decided to close it again. "Don't forget the Garshes thing Saturday." "I won't." And then, this was the part that stayed with him. She looked directly at him for a long, unreadable second, and he looked back. Neither of them spoke. Whatever had been approaching the surface retreated, and the moment passed, and she went upstairs. He sat in the quiet of the living room for a long time. He thought about what it meant that they had lived in this house for 11 years and could sit in the same room for 2 hours without actually seeing each other. Then he said very quietly, to no one in particular, "I don't know. Maybe like this story or subscribe or something." He blinked. The room looked back at him. He shook his head once, a small motion like clearing a thought, and set down his glass and went to bed. It happened on a Sunday in April without any of the architecture of confrontation. Jonathan had gone out to the car to retrieve his phone, left on the seat from a grocery run. He was crossing back through the hallway when he heard Melissa's voice through the back door, which stood an inch open to the spring air. She was on the patio, phone to her ear. He stopped. Not deliberately. The sound stopped him. I know, but his birthday was last month and I barely felt anything. It's like..." A pause. "Like going through motions, Aaron." I don't know how much longer I can pretend the life I have is the one I want." He stood very still. He doesn't see it. He doesn't see me. He never asks. She laughed softly, the private laugh, the one he'd heard through the office door. "Honestly, sometimes I just wish he'd disappear. Before my birthday even. Just gone, so I could figure out who I am without navigating around him." Jonathan stood in the hallway of his house with his phone in his hand and his coat still on, and felt the sentence settle into him like something had been diagnosed at last. He walked back to the kitchen, set his keys on the counter, put the kettle on. When Melissa came in from the patio 5 minutes later, he was sitting at the island with a cup of tea. "Cold out," he said. "A bit." She set her phone face down on the counter. Something in her register shifted. A micro adjustment, barely perceptible. He looked at her. Not with accusation, just looked. "Are you happy?" he asked. She paused in the act of reaching for the wine glass. "What kind of question is that? A real one." She set the glass down. The silence expanded. He watched her work through it. The denial, the deflection, the version of herself that would say, "Of course I am. Why are you being weird?" And then she didn't say any of it. "I don't know," she said finally. "Okay, I don't know what you want me to say, Jonathan. I don't want you to say anything in particular." He turned the mug in his hands. "I just wanted to ask." "You're asking like there's a right answer." Her voice had an edge now, not cruelty, but the sharpness of someone who felt cornered without understanding by what. "There isn't." She sat down across from him, and for a moment they were just two people at a kitchen island at 9 on a Sunday night, and the distance between them felt not like hostility but like geography. Real, established, and hard to cross. "I feel..." She stopped, started again. "I feel like I've been trying to be something here for a long time, and I don't know if you've noticed." "Either way, I noticed." "Then why didn't you?" But she stopped herself, because she knew the answer was that she hadn't asked, and neither had he, and they had both let the silence expand into a chasm while pretending they were just giving each other space. "What are you doing for your birthday?" he asked. The subject change startled her. I don't know yet, haven't thought about it." "I'll make a reservation," he said. "Somewhere nice." She looked at him uncertainly. "You don't have to. I know." He took his tea and went upstairs. He heard her sit in the kitchen for a long time. That night, lying awake in the dark, Jonathan made a quiet decision. Not from anger, not from revenge, from something more fundamental. The simple, unfashionable dignity of a man who had finally heard clearly what had probably been said in other ways for years, and decided that he would not pretend he hadn't. He thought about what she'd said. Just gone, he would accommodate that. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Jonathan's life. He went to work. He came home. He cooked on Thursdays and cleared the gutters in late April and stood in the shower for longer than necessary, moving through the days with the focused calm of a man executing a plan. Because he was. He began with the finances. The joint account had served its purpose for 11 years, but Jonathan was a man who read fine print, who understood liquidity and liability, who had managed his own parents' estate with such quiet precision that no one had noticed the work. He opened a personal account at a different bank. He transferred his direct deposit. He reviewed every statement going back 3 years with the same methodical attention he brought to commercial claims. That was when he found them. Not found them dramatically. No shoebox of secrets. Just line items, recurring transfers to an account he didn't recognize starting 2 years ago. Small enough to miss in the aggregate flow, significant enough across 24 months to constitute a shadow budget. He ran the number. It was not a small number. A loan he discovered, taken out against the equity of the house using both their names, her signature on the documents, his forged or misremembered or simply not remembered correctly by someone who had not been paying attention. He sat with the documents for a long time. He made copies. He put them somewhere Melissa would not find. He did not confront her with this. That was not his intention. Meanwhile, Melissa was having what she privately thought of as a clarifying season. After the Sunday conversation in the kitchen, which she'd replayed many times since. Unsatisfied with her own part in it, she had told herself that Jonathan's quietness was guilt, or acceptance, or the beginning of his understanding that she needed more. She told Claire, the real Claire now returned from Phoenix, that she thought things might finally be shifting. Claire had nodded carefully in the way of a friend who has watched this story long enough to know she isn't hearing all of it. Aaron was a comfort. She wouldn't say more than that, even to herself, though the days she spent near him had a particular quality, the feeling of being witnessed, of mattering in real time. She told herself she deserved that. Maybe she did. The problem with self-serving narratives is not that they're false exactly, but that they're incomplete. Jonathan made a reservation for her birthday. Rosario, the Italian place she'd mentioned once, 2 years ago, in passing. She hadn't expected him to remember. She told Aaron she thought Jonathan was trying. Aaron said, quietly, that she should think about what she wanted. She said she was thinking. She was thinking about it constantly. She was not thinking about the loan. Jonathan, for his part, was thinking about almost nothing else. Not with anger, or not only, with the peculiar grief of a man who had handed someone his trust like a physical object and was now receiving it back broken. The financial deception was its own wound, separate from the emotional abandonment, but the two had fused together into something he couldn't separate and no longer tried to. He visited a lawyer in late April. A woman named Patricia Mercer, referred by a colleague who listened to everything with the practiced neutrality of a person paid to understand the worst of human arrangements. She reviewed what he brought. She said very little. She told him what was possible and what wasn't, and what would take time and what he needed to document. He documented everything. There was a Tuesday in May, weeks before Melissa's birthday, when he came home to find her laughing at something on her phone, and the sound struck him with an intensity he hadn't expected. Not jealousy. Something more like mourning. He stood in the kitchen for a moment while she composed herself without looking up, and he thought, I did love her. I want to be clear about that. I loved her for a long time and in all the ways I knew how, and it wasn't enough, and I don't know which of us is more responsible for that, and it doesn't matter anymore. He made dinner. They ate. He was very kind to her in those weeks, more present than he'd been in months. He asked about her work. He remembered things she mentioned. If Melissa noticed the quality of his attention, its retrospective, cataloging quality, she read it as effort, as a man finally waking up, as proof that the distance had been mutual and was now contracting. She began, quietly, to feel guilty about Aaron. About the loan. About the wishes she'd expressed on the patio that she hoped Jonathan had not heard through the door. She bought a dress for her birthday dinner. She looked forward to it with something that surprised her, a tentative warmth, the possibility of a different chapter. She thought maybe they could find it again. She'd thought this before at other low points, and nothing had changed, but this time felt different. He seemed different. He seemed different. He was different, but not in the way she was hoping for. Her birthday was a Saturday in June. Melissa woke to a house that smelled like nothing, which was the first thing. No coffee. She came downstairs in her robe and the kitchen was clean. Not just clean, but empty. The countertops cleared in a way that felt less like tidiness and more like removal. Jonathan's mug was gone from the drying rack. The French press was gone. The leather jacket he hung by the front door was not there. She checked the garage. His car was not there. She stood in the kitchen for a long moment. Then she went to the kitchen table, where something was sitting in a manila envelope, her name written on the front in his handwriting, small and clear, the way he wrote everything. Inside, divorce papers, already drawn. A letter from Patricia Mercer, family law attorney. And behind that, a separate document that took her 2 readings to understand fully, a statement of the joint home equity loan with a note attached in his hand. You should speak to a lawyer about this. I'd suggest doing it soon. She sat down. The dress she'd bought for dinner was still in the bag on the bedroom chair. Rosario had a reservation under their name at 7 o'clock. She didn't think she would be going. She called Jonathan's phone. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. Not an immediate rejection, just the natural expiration of an unanswered call. She didn't leave a message. She called again an hour later. the same. At some point, she called Aaron, and when he answered, she found she didn't know what to say. She said Jonathan had left. Aaron was quiet for a moment and then said he was sorry. He sounded like he meant it. He also did not say, "I'll come over," or "I'll be right there." And she noticed that, sitting on the kitchen floor with her back against the cabinets, the divorce papers on the table above her, she stayed on the floor for a while, not crying or not only, mostly thinking. She thought about the patio, the phone call he may or may not have heard. She thought about the loan, the way it had seemed, at the time, like a reasonable solution to a private problem. Money she'd needed and couldn't ask for, because asking would have required a conversation she hadn't wanted to have. She thought about how she'd never intended to be the kind of person who forged a signature. But then she also hadn't fully admitted to herself that that was what she'd done, because admitting it required looking at herself directly. She thought about what she'd told Aaron on that call. "I don't know how much longer I can pretend the life I have is the one I want." And she thought, sitting on the floor of the kitchen, that this was true. She'd meant it, but she had also imagined that the undoing of the life she had would happen on her timeline, by her decision, in a way that left her in the better position. She had not imagined coming down the stairs on her birthday to find the coffee unmade, and the man who had made it every day for 11 years already gone. She hadn't thought about how it would feel to have her wish granted. 3 weeks later, she ran into him. Not an accident. He'd agreed to meet briefly to discuss a logistics question the lawyers needed resolved. They chose a coffee shop equidistant between their separate lives. He was already there when she arrived, sitting at a corner table with water, his coat on the back of the chair. He looked, she thought, like himself. That was the unsettling thing. She'd expected something, damage or relief, or the visible cost of what had happened. He just looked like Jonathan, a little more rested maybe. "How are you?" she asked, sitting down. "Fine." He meant it, she could tell. "You?" "I've been." She stopped, looked at the table. "I've been better." He nodded, not unkindly. The logistics question took 8 minutes. He had the relevant document she signed where indicated, and the conversation served its purpose. Then they sat for a moment with the business done. "Why didn't you say anything?" she asked. She hadn't planned to. "On the patio, if you heard, it wasn't about the patio." She looked at him. "It wasn't just that," he amended. "It was." He thought for a moment, the way he always thought before speaking, that careful pause she used to find frustrating and now found she missed. A lot of things had already been said, just not to me. She didn't answer. "I'm not angry, Melissa." He said it evenly, looking at her. "I want you to know that. I'm not doing this from anger." "What are you doing it from?" He picked up his coffee. Set it down. "I think," he said slowly, "I spent a long time in a marriage that had ended, and I kept maintaining it because I didn't know what else to do. And at some point I realized that maintaining something that's over isn't loyalty. It's just," he paused, "avoidance." She looked at the window. Outside, June moved past, people with coffees, a kid on a scooter, the ordinary texture of a Saturday. "I thought this year might be different," she said. "I really did." "I know. That doesn't." She stopped, tried again. "That doesn't make me feel better." "I know that too." They sat for a moment longer. There was something almost peaceful about it, the absence of performance. No one was playing a role. They were just two people at a corner table who had been something to each other for a long time and now were arriving, slowly, at the other side of it. She thought about saying she was sorry, about the loan, about Aaron, about the patio, about the years of moving toward the exit without ever being honest enough to announce it. The apology formed in her chest, real and substantial. She could feel the weight of it, but she didn't say it. Not because she was too proud, exactly. More because she sensed, looking at Jonathan's face, calm, already somewhere else, the way you look when you've processed something fully and come out the other end, that the apology was for her, not for him. He didn't need it to move. She needed to give it to feel absolved. And that was a different thing entirely. So she held it. Jonathan left first, standing with the neat efficiency of a man who had somewhere to be. He put on his coat. He picked up his document. "Take care of yourself," he said. "You too." He walked out of the coffee shop, and she watched him go through the window, crossing the parking lot, reaching his car. The same steady, unhurried pace he had always had. Then he was gone. Melissa sat alone at the corner table. Around her, the coffee shop moved and murmured and went on. She held her cup with both hands. Outside, the morning continued being a morning, indifferent and ordinary, and the life she had wished herself out of was gone, and the life she had wished herself into had not arrived. And she sat in the space between them, quiet and alone, and more awake than she had been in years. The reservation at Rosario went unclaimed. By the following month, the table they might have sat at would be occupied by someone else's story, a couple marking an anniversary, or a first date, or a farewell that looked like a celebration. The restaurant didn't know the difference. It never does.